The sun had barely touched the horizon, yet inside Buckingham Palace, a storm was already brewing. At 3:12 a.m., the palace corridors were eerily silent, save for the hurried footsteps of an aide clutching a thick red folder stamped with the king's seal. Imagine waking up to a world where every rule you thought was set in stone can be rewritten in a single sweep of a pen. That was the world King Charles found himself in. And by dawn, the impossible had happened. Camilla, once the queen consort, had just had her powers quietly and decisively transferred to Catherine. But why? And how did it come to this? And more importantly, what does it mean for the future of the British monarchy? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The palace has always been a theater of subtle tensions, whispers behind gilded doors, and decisions that ripple across centuries. But this morning, the stakes were different. No public announcement, no carefully orchestrated media rollout. Just a king, awake before the world, staring at a report that would upend everything he thought he knew about loyalty, power, and the delicate balance of his family. It was a choice that could save a monarchy or fracture it entirely. What compelled Charles to act with such urgency? What secret did this report reveal that forced him to override weeks of hesitation and delay? Was it Camilla's rising controversies, Catherine's surging public admiration, or a combination of forces so volatile that waiting any longer could risk everything? Consider this. In the hours before dawn, the palace was not a place of routine. It became a battlefield. Advisors whispered in shadowed corners. Messages were sent in codes only a handful could interpret, and Charles faced one of the most gut-wrenching decisions of his reign. In private, he had wrestled with the idea that even love and loyalty could not always align with the best interests of the monarchy. He had loved Camilla, trusted her, defended her against public scrutiny, but the truth on the table at 3:12 a.m. was brutal. Public sentiment was shifting, internal advisors were growing restless, and the fragile balance of the royal household was tipping dangerously. Catherine, on the other hand, had been rising steadily, not by choice, but by circumstance. Every public appearance, every speech, every gesture of empathy and composure had positioned her as the stabilizing force the monarchy desperately needed. Where Camilla had begun to falter under scrutiny, Catherine had excelled. Where Camilla's decisions had provoked whispers of scandal, Catherine inspired admiration. And Charles, reading the report, understood that the moment for decisive action had arrived. You might be wondering, how could such a transfer of power even happen? Surely the queen consort's position is unshakable, anchored by tradition and centuries of precedent? And yet, this was no ordinary circumstance. Charles was operating under an emergency protocol, one rarely invoked, and one that allowed him, in exceptional moments, to redistribute authority for the sake of stability. The protocol itself was known to very few, a document kept in a locked vault, a set of instructions buried in historical charters, waiting for a moment like this. And now, that moment had arrived. But even within this controlled chaos, the human element could not be ignored. Imagine Camilla waking up to a palace in subtle turmoil, a hint of tension in every glance, a whisper here and there, a sense that something unprecedented was underway. She did not yet know the extent of Charles's decision, yet the currents of change were palpable. Meanwhile, Charles faced the unbearable weight of anticipation. The act of transferring powers is not merely administrative. It is symbolic, psychological, and public. One wrong move could shatter relationships, destabilize the court, and send shockwaves across the Commonwealth. And then there was the red folder. Inside were the three triggers that pushed Charles to act. They were explicit, precise, and damning in their implications. The first detailed Camilla's increasing missteps, both public and private, which had eroded trust among senior advisors. The second highlighted Catherine's rise as the public's favored figure in moments of crisis, a queen in waiting not by title, but by competence and emotional authority. The third, perhaps the most alarming, was a set of projections. What could happen if the status quo persisted, including potential crises in diplomacy, public approval, and familial discord? Now, imagine the weight of that folder in Charles's hands. Each page a calculated risk, each line a warning. And yet, he could not delay. Not a single moment. By dawn, the order had to be signed. This was a king who understood the subtleties of power, the art of timing, and the brutal calculus of monarchy. But even the most seasoned monarch could not anticipate every reaction. Camilla would not accept this quietly. Advisors whispered of potential confrontations, of private conversations that could turn into battles, of alliances within the palace that might shift unpredictably. As the first rays of sunlight stretched across London, Charles's pen hovered over the document. The act of signing was deliberate, monumental, and irreversible. At that moment, history was being written, not in public proclamations, not on social media, but in the silent corridors of Buckingham Palace. A transfer of authority was underway, and the implications were far-reaching. Catherine would assume powers that had long been Camilla's, but with her assumed authority came scrutiny, expectations, and the delicate task of balancing tradition with modern monarchy. Yet the story doesn't end with the signature. The palace staff were already bracing for the fallout. Whispers spread like wildfire. Aides questioned loyalties, and the press, if they discovered the hints, would ignite a frenzy. What Charles had initiated quietly in the dark would soon be impossible to conceal. Every conversation, every glance, every decision in the coming days would carry the weight of this moment. The monarchy was entering uncharted territory, and no one, not even the king, could fully predict the outcome. But here's the most intriguing part. The move was not solely Charles's decision. There were influencers behind the scenes, advisors who had waited years for a moment like this. Their counsel had been decisive, their insistence unwavering. And now, they were watching, anticipating every ripple of reaction, every expression on Camilla's face, every public response to Catherine's new authority. Who were they, and why had they convinced the king that dawn was the only acceptable hour to act? This is where the drama intensifies. Because while the world was asleep, the palace was awake with tension, fear, and anticipation. Every tick of the clock, every rustle of paper, every cautious step echoed in the halls as the monarchy shifted subtly, yet profoundly, from one power structure to another. The morning that seemed ordinary to Londoners was anything but ordinary within those walls. And the questions multiply. How will Camilla respond? Will Catherine rise to the challenge seamlessly, or will the weight of her new powers crush her under expectations? What will this mean for Charles's legacy, for William's future, for the monarchy's image abroad? Every decision, every conversation, every minor reaction could have cascading effects that echo for decades. By sunrise, a new chapter had begun. The king had acted, the order was signed, and a quiet revolution within the palace had started. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The palace waited with bated breath. The world, unaware, continued its morning routines, oblivious to the seismic shifts within the British monarchy. And for those few awake and aware in the gilded corridors, one truth was undeniable. History does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in the hush of early morning, in the careful signing of a pen, and in the quiet transfer of power that would alter the balance of a royal dynasty forever. At 3:12 a.m., the palace was not asleep. It never truly is, of course. There is always a night watch, a rotating guard, aides on call, but this night felt different. The air was thick with tension, the kind of tension that makes every footstep echo louder than it should, every rustle of paper a potential warning. One aide, who had served Buckingham for nearly a decade, described it later as the night the palace held its breath. Imagine being the one to carry the folder containing orders that would rewrite the balance of power in the monarchy. Imagine knowing that a single mistake, a single misstep, could cascade into scandal, chaos, or even a breach of trust so deep it might never be repaired. The aide clutched the thick red folder tightly, almost as if it were a life raft in a stormy sea. Inside were 3 documents: the emergency order Charles had authorized, an assessment of Camilla's recent activities, and a confidential report on Catherine's rising influence. Something no member of the press, no historian, no outsider had ever seen. The folder was more than paper. It was a symbol, a prelude to a seismic shift in royal power. Charles himself had been awake for hours before receiving the folder. His advisors had contacted him in hushed tones just after 2 a.m., saying that the situation could no longer wait. What exactly triggered this emergency, and why now? To understand, you need to imagine the palace in full operational mode at a time when the world outside is silent. The king's private office, normally serene and methodical, became a hive of urgency. Messages were typed, then deleted, then rewritten. Calls were placed, then canceled, then redirected. Charles had to act carefully, balancing protocol with the urgency of the moment. The clock ticked toward 3:30 a.m. when the first confrontation occurred. Charles gathered his closest advisors, men and women who had been loyal for decades, and began reviewing the evidence in the folder. The first page detailed Camilla's increasing missteps, both public and private. From minor faux pas in state correspondence to a growing pattern of offhand comments that undermined key diplomatic relationships, the report was meticulous. It cataloged each error with precision, noting timing, audience, and potential repercussions. Every line was a subtle drumbeat of pressure, echoing the silent warning, delay no longer. By 4 a.m., the king faced a series of choices. Should he confront Camilla first, risk open conflict, or proceed in silence, preparing the order for signature before she even awoke? The advisors recommended the latter. History, they argued, is shaped by those who act decisively, not by those who wait. And Charles, who had learned the delicate art of timing in every political, personal, and royal matter, understood this implicitly. Hesitation could be catastrophic. Meanwhile, the palace staff were shifting in shadows, preparing for the unseen storm. Every footstep, every whispered conversation carried weight. Some staff were unaware of the gravity of the orders. Others were acutely aware, sensing that a historical pivot was underway. Courtiers who had once viewed Charles with mild skepticism now watched him closely, understanding that their loyalty would be tested in the hours to come. By 4:30 a.m., Charles had reviewed the confidential report on Catherine. Her rise, subtle but undeniable, had been measured in public approval, diplomatic finesse, and personal charisma. Every speech, every public engagement, every charitable initiative added to her momentum. In the eyes of the monarchy's inner circle, Catherine was no longer simply a supportive spouse. She was emerging as the stabilizing force the monarchy needed. And where Catherine rose, Camilla's influence was slipping. The contrast could not have been starker. As the first hints of dawn crept through the tall windows of the palace, Charles made the decision. The emergency order would be drafted, signed, and delivered. Before the world woke, before Camilla could even sense the change in the winds. The drafting process was meticulous. Every word had to be precise. Every phrase was calculated to convey authority without causing irreparable damage. The king's pen hovered over the document for minutes, each second loaded with consequence. When he finally signed, it was a deliberate act, monumental in its simplicity. A stroke of ink, and history had shifted. But the drama was far from over. Camilla, unaware of the decision, would soon awaken to a world that had subtly, yet profoundly, changed around her. Advisors anticipated her reaction, disbelief, anger, and perhaps even a silent but searing sense of betrayal. No one could predict exactly how she would respond, but one thing was clear: she would not go quietly. The aide carrying the folder navigated the silent halls, aware that every step could be observed. Every closed door might conceal a critical witness. Every shadow could hide someone ready to intervene. When the folder was finally delivered to the designated official, the weight of its contents seemed almost tangible. It was not merely a folder. It was a statement, a warning, and a herald of the dawn that would follow. And then came the phone calls. Charles, still in his private office, received updates from aides and courtiers. Some were routine, others urgent, each carrying implications that could escalate the situation at any moment. One message, in particular, stood out. A note from a senior advisor who had been observing Camilla's interactions for weeks. The advisor warned that Camilla's next move, if unchecked, could destabilize the palace, erode public trust, and even jeopardize Charles's authority. It was a stark reminder that the emergency order was not just procedural, it was existential. By 5:30 a.m., the palace was in a delicate balance. Staff whispered in corners, courtiers adjusted plans, and Charles remained focused, aware that the next few minutes would define the trajectory of the monarchy. Outside, the city began to stir, oblivious to the monumental decisions unfolding within Buckingham's walls. The king's signature had set the gears in motion, but the human element, the reactions, the confrontations, the loyalties, remained unpredictable. As dawn approached, the palace seemed to hold its breath. Charles, seated at his desk, glanced at the folder one final time. The decision had been made. The pen had moved. The order was complete. Catherine's authority was now formally recognized in areas previously under Camilla's purview. And yet, a sense of foreboding lingered. History had been shaped in silence, but the consequences would be loud, far-reaching, and potentially explosive. By 6 a.m., the palace was alive with subtle movements. Staff had begun carrying out the logistics of the new orders, preparing to notify relevant departments discreetly. Courtiers whispered about the sudden rise of Catherine's influence and the quiet diminution of Camilla's powers. Every interaction was charged with anticipation, and even those not directly involved could feel the shift in the air. And in the midst of it all, Charles reflected on the gravity of his decision. He understood that the emergency order was more than a piece of paper. It was a turning point. A single stroke of ink had altered relationships, responsibilities, and perceptions. The decision would ripple through the monarchy, through public opinion, and through history itself. Yet, he also knew that the most dangerous moment was yet to come, the instant when Camilla would awaken and realize the extent of the change. The dawn orders had been signed. The wheels were in motion. The palace was silent, tense, and poised for the next act. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. That it's one thing to hold power, and quite another to wield it without leaving cracks for the world, or the palace, to notice. Camilla had entered her role with elegance and discretion, but over time, subtle fractures began appearing. At first, they were barely noticeable: a misjudged remark at a charity event, a slight misstep in protocol, a comment taken out of context by the press. These incidents alone would not have been catastrophic. But patterns, as Charles and his advisors knew, tell the truth more effectively than a single scandal ever could. The first whisper of concern came from inside the palace itself. Courtiers who had once defended Camilla now found themselves exchanging uneasy glances, noting her growing detachment from the advisory process. She had been a steady presence during public engagements, yes. But behind the closed doors of state meetings and private consultations, her focus sometimes wavered. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to outsiders, but advisors documented it meticulously. They were not gossiping. They were preparing a record of concern, understanding that decisions made in these rooms could shape public trust for years to come. Camilla's rising missteps were not only about protocol. There were moments when her words suggested impatience, frustration, or even irritation with those around her. At a high-profile diplomatic lunch in London, an aide would later recall, Camilla had challenged a visiting official in a manner that was considered unorthodox, even confrontational. The aide described the room as frozen in shock, with conversations faltering and courtiers scrambling to recover the moment. It wasn't overtly scandalous, but it planted a seed. A question of whether Camilla was fully prepared to navigate the delicate dance of influence expected of a queen consort. Even public appearances, which were traditionally her stronghold, began to draw scrutiny. Paparazzi captured moments of hesitation, small gestures that seemed offbeat, smiles that didn't reach her eyes. Every observer, from the casual citizen to seasoned royal commentators, began piecing together an image that differed from the polished veneer expected of a consort. Charles himself had begun to notice the pattern, and it worried him, not because he doubted her loyalty, but because the monarchy depended on perception as much as reality. The line between private actions and public interpretation is razor thin, and Camilla's pattern suggested it was fraying. Behind the palace walls, her relationship with senior advisors had grown tense. Those closest to the king had begun privately questioning her judgment, voicing concerns in soft tones that carried weight only in those quiet corridors. Reports reached Charles in confidential briefings, highlighting the subtle but consistent pattern of lapses: invitations mishandled, speeches poorly timed, and even social engagements that inadvertently overshadowed the king's own initiatives. It was a web of minor issues that, together, created an undeniable narrative of decline. And then there was the friction with Catherine. It started innocently enough. Overlapping charitable initiatives, competing schedules, and differing approaches to diplomacy and public engagement. Catherine, with her calm demeanor, thoughtful planning, and rising public admiration, naturally began to draw attention. The palace began noticing how crowds reacted, photographers capturing smiles, the press praising her composure, public sentiment trending favorably. Meanwhile, Camilla's earlier missteps seemed magnified by contrast. Where she faltered, Catherine excelled. Where she stumbled, Catherine's grace became a spotlight. This contrast was not lost on Charles. As a king, he had to weigh loyalty against necessity. Camilla had been steadfast for decades, a partner in life and duty. But Catherine had become something more, a figure who could stabilize the monarchy during uncertain times, someone the public trusted implicitly, someone who could project continuity and confidence. The tension between personal loyalty and public duty began to reach a critical point. Advisors whispered that the monarchy could no longer afford to ignore the pattern. Action was required. Even the media, subtle though it was, began amplifying the issues. Leaks and anonymous tips painted Camilla as overstepping, emotionally reactive, or disconnected from the evolving expectations of modern monarchy. Headlines, carefully avoided in prior decades, now hinted at discontent and dysfunction, fueling the palace's concern. Social media analytics and public polling. Tools the monarchy monitored quietly reflected a growing trend. Catherine's approval rating skyrocketed, while Camilla's began a slow, worrying decline. The tipping point came not with a single act, but with a combination of small incidents that together painted a picture too stark to ignore. A high-level diplomatic visit in Paris had been mishandled, causing a minor rift in ceremonial protocol. A charity gala in London saw Camilla misstep in her remarks, drawing subtle but significant criticism from seasoned attendees. Even private notes meant to be confidential found their way into advisory reports, revealing communication gaps and lapses in judgment that previously might have been overlooked. The internal narrative crystallized. Camilla, once a steady hand, was now a potential liability. Charles wrestled privately with the implications. Could he confront Camilla directly without damaging loyalty or causing public scandal? Could he rely on Catherine's rising influence to mitigate the risk? Advisors laid out scenarios, projecting potential outcomes for months to come. Each scenario painted the same picture. Action was required, and delaying would only exacerbate risk. The emergency protocol, rarely invoked, became a topic of serious discussion. Its provisions allowed the king to redistribute authority temporarily, quietly, and with discretion, an extraordinary measure, but one the circumstances seemed to demand. Even as Charles pondered his options, he considered the human element. Camilla had been a partner through decades of scrutiny, navigating challenges with him that few could imagine. To sideline her, even partially, would be painful, not just for the palace but personally. And yet, history often demands choices that are uncomfortable, painful, and fraught with consequence. The monarchy was larger than any single individual, and Charles knew the moment for decisive action had arrived. The palace itself reflected the tension. Staff sensed the shift even before official orders were drafted. Courtiers whispered in corners, aides moved with heightened awareness, and the usual rhythm of palace life felt disrupted. Every interaction, every glance, every step carried weight. And Camilla, still unaware of the brewing storm, moved through her morning with an illusion of normalcy, an illusion that would soon be shattered. The first page of the advisory report noted Camilla's most subtle missteps, framing them in terms of risk, diplomatic friction, public perception, and internal discord. The second page highlighted Catherine's stabilizing presence and public favor. The third, most damning, projected the consequences of inaction, a monarchy increasingly perceived as divided, with diminishing public trust and potential political repercussions across the Commonwealth. Each page was a ticking clock, pushing Charles toward the decision he would make before sunrise. As the first light of dawn crept into London, Charles's decision crystallized. The emergency order would be signed. Camilla's powers, quietly and formally, would be transferred to Catherine. The move would be subtle yet monumental, invisible to the public but seismic within the palace. Charles understood the implications. Loyalty would be tested, trust would be strained, and the delicate balance of family and monarchy would shift forever. But even with the decision made, the palace held its breath. Camilla would awaken soon. She would sense the change, feel the shift in energy, and react. Advisors predicted a range of reactions: disbelief, fury, negotiation, even silence. What she did next could determine whether the transfer of authority would be smooth or catastrophic. And so, as the sun rose over Buckingham Palace, one thing was certain. The monarchy had entered a new era, but the drama was far from over. Camilla's missteps had set the stage, Catherine's rise had provided the momentum, and Charles's decisive action had initiated the change. But what came next, the confrontation, the reaction, the domino effect, would change everything. The palace, steeped in centuries of tradition, was now the epicenter of a quiet revolution. And the world, still unaware, continued its morning routines, oblivious to the seismic shift underway behind gilded doors. But those inside knew the truth. Camilla's era of influence was waning, Catherine's authority was ascending, and the monarchy's balance had forever shifted. And as Charles watched the sun crest the horizon, one thought lingered. What would Camilla do when she discovered the truth? It started with a single appearance, one public event, one speech, one gesture that, on the surface, seemed small, but beneath it carried the weight of an entirely new narrative. Catherine had always been meticulous, measured, deliberate, but in recent months, something had shifted. The public, the press, even members of the royal household began noticing a presence that was at once commanding, approachable, and profoundly reassuring. Picture this. A gala in central London, a crowd of dignitaries and diplomats, lights flashing, cameras rolling. Catherine entered not with pomp, but with quiet confidence. Her greeting was warm, her smile genuine, her words perfectly calibrated. In that moment, she wasn't merely performing the role expected of a royal. She was embodying the essence of leadership itself. The applause was polite at first, then swelling, undeniable, almost instinctual. Observers would later describe it as a tidal wave of admiration, an energy that transformed the room and subtly shifted attention away from her predecessor. What made this surge so remarkable was its timing. Camilla, already navigating the delicate tension within the palace, had been expected to maintain public favor. But Catherine's rise was not just about optics, it was about substance. Her speech addressed contemporary issues with empathy and insight, balancing charity initiatives, global concerns, and domestic matters in a way that resonated with an increasingly discerning public. Every word, every gesture, every glance was scrutinized, and Catherine passed with distinction. The palace noticed. Advisors who had been quietly observing Catherine's trajectory reported metrics, public sentiment analyses, and even subtle nods from foreign dignitaries. The numbers were unmistakable. Catherine was becoming the public's preferred figure, the stabilizing force in a monarchy beset by quiet crises. Where Camilla had stumbled, Catherine excelled. Where missteps had previously drawn attention to weakness, Catherine's careful planning drew attention to strength. Charles, receiving these updates in confidential briefings, felt a mix of pride and urgency. Pride in Catherine's natural aptitude, urgency because he knew the contrast could not be ignored. Every display of competence by Catherine implicitly highlighted Camilla's growing missteps. It was a paradox of perception. The more Catherine excelled, the more obvious Camilla's lapses appeared. Advisors noted this with clinical precision, cautioning that continued inaction could further destabilize the monarchy's carefully maintained balance. But Catherine's surge was not only public, it was also strategic behind the scenes. She had begun establishing relationships with senior aides, diplomats, and advisors in ways that complemented, rather than competed with, Charles. Her influence was growing organically, quietly, without overt confrontation. And yet, the effect was undeniable. The palace was recognizing her as a leader in her own right, a stabilizer in a time of quiet turbulence. You might ask, how did the public perception amplify so quickly? In an age where social media, global coverage, and public opinion intertwine, Catherine's every action was magnified. Her speeches, meticulously documented and shared, reached millions within hours. Analysts tracked engagement rates, noting unprecedented spikes in approval and admiration. Comments ranged from awe at her composure to heartfelt admiration for her empathy. Meanwhile, Camilla's public interactions, once lauded, began to attract subtle scrutiny. The contrast was stark, and advisors reported it as a critical factor in the timing of the dawn orders. Then came the tipping point, a small but historically significant moment. During a visit to a London hospital, Catherine knelt to speak with patients and families. Her words were gentle yet authoritative, her presence calming. Cameras captured a fleeting but powerful image, a child holding her hand, eyes wide with trust and admiration. The public reaction was immediate. News outlets ran headlines praising her compassion, analysts cited it as evidence of a modernizing monarchy, and social media buzz elevated her status even further. This singular moment, simple as it was, crystallized her emerging role as the stabilizing figure the monarchy needed. Inside the palace, this moment did not go unnoticed. Advisors began discussing contingency plans, both for Catherine's continued rise and for Camilla's potential reactions. Private conversations shifted. Rather than merely observing, palace officials began strategizing, calculating, and preparing for the inevitable transition of influence. The quiet ascendance of Catherine, once merely a topic of discussion, had now become a factor in the very decisions that would be made at dawn. Charles, receiving detailed briefings, understood the implications. Public favor, while intangible, wields real power within the monarchy. A consort's influence is only as strong as the perception of stability they project, and Catherine, through her actions, had projected not just stability but strength, empathy, and leadership. In contrast, Camilla's occasional lapses and private missteps, though minor in isolation, now seemed magnified. Every gesture, every word, every smile was under the microscope, and Catherine's rise made the scrutiny unavoidable. It wasn't just perception, either. Catherine's influence began to shape policy and planning in subtle ways. She offered advice during briefings, contributed insights into charitable initiatives, and demonstrated an intuitive understanding of public sentiment. Advisors reported her input as measured, thoughtful, and increasingly impactful. Her rise was not a coup. It was the natural result of competence meeting opportunity. Yet, as Charles considered the implications, a private worry gnawed at him. How would Camilla respond to Catherine's growing authority? Would she accept the shift gracefully, or would her reaction complicate the carefully orchestrated transition? These questions added pressure to the decision-making process. Every moment of Catherine's surge made the dawn orders more urgent, more necessary, and more irreversible. And then came the report, delivered confidentially, at 3:12 a.m., the night Charles would sign the orders. The report explicitly noted the contrast between Camilla and Catherine. It highlighted missteps, public perception trends, and projected outcomes if the status quo persisted. Catherine's rise was identified as a stabilizing factor. Camilla's continued influence was labeled as a growing risk. The recommendation was clear: action was required immediately. Charles, reviewing the document, could see the inevitability of the decision. By sunrise, the order would need to be signed. Camilla's powers, quietly and formally, would transfer to Catherine. The public would remain unaware, but the palace and inner circle would know. History was in motion. Every aide, every advisor, every member of the household sensed the gravity of the moment. Yet the story does not end with the report. Catherine herself remained a model of discretion and composure. She did not flaunt her growing influence. She did not rush to assert dominance. Her rise was measured, deliberate, and yet undeniably potent. Her public and private actions created a convergence. The right person, at the right time, with the right support, poised to stabilize a monarchy under quiet but undeniable strain. By dawn, the pieces were in place. The decision was no longer theoretical, it was imminent. Camilla would awaken to a world subtly but profoundly changed. Catherine's surge, the public's admiration, and Charles's decisiveness would converge into a moment that would reshape the palace's power structure. The stage was set for confrontation, negotiation, and perhaps an irreparable shift in loyalties. And as Charles prepared to sign the order, one thought lingered in his mind. Catherine's rise had been building quietly, almost imperceptibly, until this moment. But what happened next? Camilla's reaction, the palace's response, the ripple effect across the monarchy, would determine whether this surge would solidify Catherine's position or ignite a storm the palace could not control. The morning of the dawn orders was not merely the start of a new day. It was the beginning of a new era. Catherine's surge had changed everything. And what came next would change everything else, and no one saw it coming. Imagine receiving a document at 3:12 in the morning that has the power to change the course of history. Not a casual memo, not a briefing note, but a confidential report so damning, so precise, that it leaves the reader with no choice but to act. For King Charles, that moment arrived on a quiet London night, when the palace corridors were silent, the guards steady, and the city outside oblivious to the seismic shift about to unfold. The report was delivered discreetly, hand to hand, by a senior aide whose loyalty had been unquestioned for decades. Its arrival was almost cinematic. The faint knock on Charles's door, the quiet rustle of paper, the whispered warning. This requires your immediate attention. Inside the thick folder was a dossier, organized meticulously into 3 sections. Camilla's recent missteps, Catherine's rising influence, and the projected consequences of inaction. Each section was filled with confidential observations, detailed analyses, and careful documentation, leaving no room for interpretation. The first section, Camilla's missteps, was thorough and calculated. Every minor incident over the last 12 months had been recorded, from diplomatic faux pas to perceived lapses in judgment at public engagements. There was a delicate balance in the way the report framed these issues. Factual, clinical, almost detached, yet unmistakably critical. Charles read each line with a mix of familiarity and dread. He had known these issues existed, but seeing them collated in black and white, in a format designed to highlight risk and pattern, was confronting. One example stood out: a state dinner in Edinburgh where a subtle miscommunication had led to an awkward pause in proceedings, leaving several visiting diplomats unsettled. By itself, it might have seemed trivial, but in the report, it was presented alongside similar incidents. A string of small, seemingly inconsequential errors that, collectively, painted a picture of inconsistency and unpredictability. Charles could not ignore the pattern. History had taught him that repeated small cracks eventually form a fracture, and fractures in a monarchy can lead to scandal. The second section highlighted Catherine's rise. Here, the contrast was glaring. While Camilla's errors were catalogued and emphasized, Catherine's actions were praised, measured, and quantified. Every public engagement, speech, and charitable initiative was meticulously noted. Approval ratings, media sentiment, and diplomatic feedback all indicated a steady upward trajectory for Catherine. The report was clear. Catherine was becoming a stabilizing force in the monarchy, a figure who inspired confidence and trust both within the palace and in the public eye. What made this section particularly striking was the human insight embedded within it. The report did not simply present statistics. It analyzed demeanor, tone, and the subtle ways Catherine connected with people. Observers had noted her ability to calm tense situations, redirect potentially awkward moments, and project authority without aggression. Each entry in this section reinforced the idea that Catherine was not only competent, but indispensable at a critical moment. The third section, perhaps the most urgent, outlined the consequences of inaction. Here, the language was stark, almost chilling. Continued delays in addressing Camilla's lapses could result in a loss of public confidence, diplomatic missteps, and internal discord that might become irreversible. Worst-case scenarios were laid out in vivid detail, ranging from minor public perception issues to potential constitutional challenges. Advisors recommended immediate action, noting that waiting even a few days could exacerbate risk. Charles absorbed the report, understanding the full weight of its implications. Each page was a calculated push toward decisive action. The recommendation was unmistakable. Camilla's powers needed to be transferred, quietly but formally, to Catherine, ensuring that the monarchy remained stable and credible. The report framed it not as a personal judgment, but as a necessary step for the institution's survival. What made the report so compelling and so urgent was its timing. Delivered at 3:12 a.m., it coincided with a critical moment in public and palace dynamics. Camilla was due to attend a high-profile engagement the next day, one that would be widely covered by the media. Any delay in action risked public perception misaligning with the palace's strategic priorities. The report emphasized the narrow window of opportunity, urging that the decision be implemented immediately. Charles's advisors had prepared him for the personal and political complexities of the decision. They noted that Camilla's reaction could range from mild disappointment to outright confrontation. Catherine's rise, while positive in terms of public perception, could provoke envy and resistance. The report included contingency plans, suggested talking points, and even possible public messaging strategies to mitigate fallout. It was thorough, leaving no detail to chance. As Charles read, he reflected on the human element. This was not merely a matter of protocol. It was a question of loyalty, trust, and emotional intelligence. Camilla had been a partner in life, a confidant, and a key figure in the monarchy for decades. The decision to transfer her powers, even partially, was not just administrative, it was deeply personal. Yet the evidence was clear, the risks real, and the recommendation urgent. Hesitation could be catastrophic. At this moment, Charles also had to confront the personal stakes. Camilla had been a partner through storms and triumphs alike, yet her reaction to Catherine's rise was unpredictable. The report warned of potential resistance, highlighting past incidents where Camilla had expressed frustration with the shifting dynamics of influence. Advisors cautioned that even a private conversation could escalate if handled improperly. Charles needed precision, timing, and strategy to navigate this delicate moment. By 4 a.m., the decision had crystallized. The report had done its job. It left no ambiguity, no room for procrastination. The loss of stabilizing figure was the line that forced the hand of the king. Every factor, public perception, internal cohesion, diplomatic stability, converged to create a singular imperative. Action must be taken before the first light of day. Charles now had to plan the execution. The emergency order, rarely invoked and carefully codified, allowed for the temporary transfer of power in extraordinary circumstances. Normally, such measures were reserved for crises of state, sudden incapacity, unforeseen emergencies, or threats to national security. This situation, though personal in nature, fit the criteria. The palace's stability and the monarchy's public trust were at stake. Advisors meticulously prepared the draft, ensuring clarity, legality, and precision. Every phrase, every word, was chosen to mitigate potential backlash. The human element, however, could not be scripted. Charles understood that Camilla's reaction would define the next chapter of this drama. She could protest, negotiate, or withdraw, but she would not accept quietly. Advisors debated possible responses, outlining scenarios ranging from discreet discussions to formal challenges. Each scenario was plausible, each carried risk, and each was weighed against the ultimate imperative: safeguarding the monarchy. Catherine's role was equally delicate. While she had risen to prominence through competence and public favor, the sudden transfer of power placed her in uncharted territory. She would inherit responsibility, influence, and scrutiny all at once. Advisors emphasized the importance of her discretion, composure, and awareness of the sensitivities involved. Catherine's grace under pressure was a stabilizing force, but it also had to be matched with strategic acumen. As 5 a.m. approached, the palace was alive with quiet tension. Staff moved deliberately, courtiers whispered, and aides prepared for the arrival of documents, briefings, and notifications. The line in the report had set a chain reaction into motion. Charles's pen would soon formalize the transfer of authority, and the palace's balance would shift irrevocably. Yet even with the decision clear, uncertainty loomed. Camilla had been deeply entrenched in palace dynamics for decades. Her alliances, insights, and influence were formidable. The report acknowledged this, cautioning that the transfer must be executed delicately to prevent overt conflict. Every step of the morning required orchestration: the delivery of documents, the alignment of advisors, and the preparation for Catherine's elevation in influence. Charles, reflecting on the report, understood the stakes. The line loss of stabilizing figure was both a warning and a call to action. It distilled complex dynamics into a single, undeniable truth. The monarchy required a stabilizing force, and Camilla's continued authority posed a risk to that equilibrium. Catherine's emergence provided the solution, but the path forward would test loyalty, diplomacy, and human endurance. By dawn, the orders were ready. The signature would formalize the transfer, making Catherine the de facto, stabilizing figure within the monarchy. The palace, while outwardly calm, was a hive of strategic preparation. Every aide, advisor, and courtier understood the historical significance of what was about to unfold. This was not merely an administrative decision. It was a pivot point in the monarchy's history. As the first rays of sunlight touched Buckingham Palace, Charles took a deep breath. The report had delivered its verdict. The line had struck with precision, and the moment for action was imminent. The pen hovered, ready to formalize the decision, aware that what followed would not only define his reign, but reshape the monarchy for generations. And yet, one question remained, unspoken and urgent. How would Camilla respond when she discovered the magnitude of the decision? The report had done its job. It had revealed the truth, the risk, and the necessity, but the human reaction remained unknown. And that reaction, when it came, would change everything. The palace had never been just about titles, appearances, or tradition. Behind the gilded walls, the monarchy was a delicate ecosystem of influence, perception, and authority. And in that ecosystem, one figure had quietly risen to a position of undeniable necessity: Catherine. She was not simply a supportive spouse or a figure of public admiration. She had become, in the eyes of Charles and his advisors, the only stabilizing force capable of maintaining the monarchy's equilibrium at a critical moment. Why? The reasons were layered, complex, and deeply compelling. Catherine's influence was subtle but powerful, a combination of public poise, private intelligence, and an almost instinctive ability to navigate delicate social, diplomatic, and political dynamics. Every public appearance reinforced her credibility. Every interaction, from greeting children at hospitals to hosting dignitaries at charitable events, radiated authority and grace. Where Camilla had faltered in subtle, almost imperceptible ways, Catherine excelled. The contrast, stark and unavoidable, made her the natural choice for the transfer of power. One of the first reasons Catherine emerged as indispensable was her emotional intelligence. Unlike many who rose through structured planning or strategic networking, Catherine's ability to read a room, to sense tension, and to respond with empathy had become legendary. In private briefings, advisors repeatedly noted her calming presence in moments of palace tension. Diplomats, aides, and even members of the royal family recognized that Catherine had a rare capacity to stabilize volatile situations. She wasn't merely competent. She was magnetic, a force that could command respect without demanding it. Public perception amplified this influence. In recent months, surveys and informal polls had shown that Catherine's approval ratings had risen steadily, eclipsing those of Camilla in several key metrics. Every speech, every charitable engagement, every subtle public gesture was tracked, analyzed, and discussed in advisory meetings. Analysts noted her ability to connect with ordinary citizens while simultaneously commanding the respect of global dignitaries. Her balance of warmth, authority, and strategic discretion made her uniquely suited to assume the stabilizing role the monarchy urgently required. Contrast this with Camilla's recent trajectory. Though loyal, dedicated, and experienced, Camilla's influence had begun to waver. Missteps, once minor, had become patterns, magnified by comparison to Catherine's increasing competence. Public perception, though slow to shift in the past, now reflected subtle doubt, whispering undercurrents that advisors could not ignore. The combination of Camilla's lapses and Catherine's rise created a stark imperative. The monarchy needed a leader who could maintain stability, and Catherine fit that role perfectly. The advisors framed the argument in precise, unambiguous terms. They emphasized that the transfer of authority was not about undermining Camilla personally. It was about safeguarding the monarchy. History, they argued, had always favored decisive leadership, especially in moments of uncertainty. Hesitation could fracture public trust, destabilize the internal hierarchy, and create vulnerabilities that adversaries, both foreign and domestic, might exploit. Catherine's ascendance was not symbolic, it was essential. Another factor bolstering Catherine's suitability was her growing experience with palace operations. Over the previous months, she had taken an increasingly active role in planning state visits, charitable initiatives, and public engagements. Her decisions were consistently thoughtful, measured, and impactful. Advisors reported that her recommendations were often the most pragmatic, balancing tradition with contemporary expectations. By contrast, Camilla's approach, while experienced, had become less predictable, occasionally creating friction within the palace. Charles, reviewing these reports, understood the stakes with crystal clarity. Loyalty, respect, and personal devotion were vital, but the monarchy's stability depended on competence, consistency, and perception. Catherine possessed all three in abundance. Camilla's continued influence, though historically significant, carried risks that could no longer be ignored. The decision, as advisors framed it, was not about personal preference. It was a matter of survival for the institution. Then there was the psychological dimension. Catherine had the ability to inspire confidence, not just within the palace, but across the public and international communities. Her demeanor suggested authority tempered with empathy, decisiveness balanced with discretion. These qualities made her uniquely capable of stepping into the role Camilla had occupied without inciting backlash or instability. In short, she could inherit authority seamlessly, preserving both the monarchy's image and its internal harmony. But the advisors were also aware of the risks. Camilla's reaction was unpredictable. She could accept the transfer with grace, contest it subtly, or resist openly. Each scenario carried potential consequences, from internal friction to public scrutiny. That was why the transfer had to be executed with precision, timing, and discretion. Catherine's own awareness of these dynamics was critical. She needed to assume authority without provoking confrontation, to balance firmness with diplomacy, and to project confidence while remaining respectful of Camilla's decades of service. By 5:30 a.m., the logic of Catherine's selection was irrefutable. She was the only figure capable of stabilizing the monarchy, preserving public trust, and ensuring continuity in both domestic and international arenas. Her rise was the culmination of personal qualities, measured public performance, and strategic awareness. The decision was not about favoritism, it was about necessity. And necessity, in this case, demanded action. Charles knew that the act of transferring Camilla's powers to Catherine would send ripples throughout the palace. Courtiers and aides would whisper, alliances would be tested, and perceptions would shift. But it was also clear that the palace required clarity. Ambiguity could be dangerous. The monarchy, while steeped in tradition, could not afford indecision. Catherine's elevation provided a solution that was both practical and symbolic, demonstrating a commitment to stability, competence, and foresight. Yet even as the logic crystallized, Charles remained aware of the human element. Camilla had been a steadfast partner through decades of scrutiny, emotional trials, and historical comparisons. The transfer of authority, even if necessary, would be deeply personal. Advisors counseled him on the approach, emphasizing empathy, timing, and the careful orchestration of communication. Catherine, too, would need guidance. She had the qualities to lead, but she also needed to navigate the sensitivities of those affected by the shift. And so, the palace moved into quiet preparation. The emergency orders were drafted, language carefully chosen, signatures aligned. Every detail was considered. The order itself, the notification process, the timing, and the management of potential reactions. Charles's role was pivotal. His signature would formalize the transfer, but the execution required seamless coordination. As the first light of dawn crept across London, the stakes were unmistakable. Catherine was poised to assume powers long held by Camilla. The decision was necessary, justified, and urgent. Yet the outcome remained uncertain. Would Camilla resist, negotiate, or withdraw gracefully? Would the palace maintain stability, or would internal tensions escalate? Every moment now carried amplified significance. By sunrise, history would record a subtle but profound shift in the monarchy's power structure. Catherine's ascent was no accident. It was the product of timing, ability, and necessity. And as Charles lifted his pen to sign, one truth remained clear. Catherine was the only figure capable of ensuring the monarchy's stability in a moment when hesitation could have disastrous consequences. But even with authority transferred on paper, the human element, the confrontation, the reaction, and the emotional fallout was only beginning. And what came next would determine whether the monarchy emerged stronger or fractured under the weight of history. The morning was quiet on the surface, but behind the heavy oak doors of Buckingham Palace, tension coiled like a spring. Camilla had awakened, oblivious to the seismic shift that had taken place in the hours before dawn. Her first movements of the day were routine: tea, a brief glance at the morning briefing, the familiar cadence of palace life. But there was an unease she could feel, subtle, almost imperceptible. It was in the way the aides moved, in the careful glances exchanged by staff, and in the silence that hung heavier than usual. Something had changed. It didn't take long for Camilla to realize what that change was. A whispered word, a sidelong glance, a subtle pause in conversation, signals that indicated her authority had been quietly recalibrated. The realization hit her not as a single shock, but as a series of accumulating punches. The careful orchestration of the previous night, the confidential report, the emergency orders, all culminating in a dawn she hadn't anticipated. Camilla, accustomed to navigating palace politics with a practiced grace, now faced a challenge unlike any she had encountered before. The confrontation began in the king's private chambers, a space both intimate and symbolic. Charles had summoned Camilla under the guise of a routine discussion, but both understood the stakes. Advisors hovered just out of sight, ready to mediate, observe, and document. Camilla, ever astute, sensed the shift immediately. The subtle weight of authority had moved, quietly, decisively, and irrevocably, and she knew the moment for diplomacy had passed. Voices were initially calm, measured, and deliberate. Charles opened with explanations of procedural necessity, referencing the confidential report, public sentiment, and internal assessments. Camilla listened, absorbing the words, her expression a careful mask of composure. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. The quiet dignity she had maintained for decades was being tested in ways she had not anticipated. Every sentence, every nuance of tone, carried the weight of an unspoken challenge, a recognition that her influence was no longer absolute. The tension escalated quickly. Camilla's voice, usually steady, began to carry hints of frustration and disbelief. She questioned the timing, the methodology, and the very premise of the transfer of authority. Her words were precise, strategic, but charged with emotion, a combination of indignation, disbelief, and a subtle undertone of betrayal. Advisors noted that she was neither panicking nor aggressive, yet every word she spoke reinforced her awareness of the dramatic shift that had taken place without her knowledge or consent. Charles, for his part, maintained a measured demeanor. He had anticipated resistance, emotional appeals, and negotiation. Yet the clarity of his own decision, grounded in duty, necessity, and the counsel of trusted advisors, gave him a quiet confidence. He acknowledged Camilla's decades of loyalty, her contributions to the monarchy, and her personal support over the years. But he also made it clear that the decision was non-negotiable. The emergency orders were in effect, and Catherine's authority, though subtle in appearance, was now formalized. The emotional spike in the room was palpable. Camilla's frustration was not just about the transfer of authority. It was about timing, communication, and the perception that she had been sidelined. She had been loyal, discreet, and supportive, yet the morning's revelations suggested a recalibration that excluded her input. Every aide, every advisor, every whisper in the room heightened the sense of tension. The confrontation was not loud, but it was intense. A battle of poise, intellect, and unspoken power dynamics. At one point, Camilla paused, her expression momentarily softening. She acknowledged Charles's intentions, even his rationale, but the underlying message was clear: she would not accept this change passively. Her eyes conveyed determination, a quiet but unyielding resolve that she had faced scrutiny, missteps, and public opinion before, and would not be diminished lightly. Advisors documented the moment with care, noting that her reaction, though composed, carried the weight of decades of experience and influence. The conversation shifted to strategy. Camilla asked pointed questions about the execution of the transfer, how it would be communicated, which responsibilities were affected, and how her legacy within the palace would be preserved. Charles responded methodically, balancing empathy with authority, careful not to provoke a reaction that could escalate beyond private discussion. The room was a masterclass in controlled confrontation, each word measured, each pause deliberate, each gesture conveying both respect and resolve. Despite the careful orchestration, the tension was undeniable. Camilla's reaction revealed the human cost of the decision. Even the most loyal and experienced figures feel betrayal when their authority is quietly diminished. Charles recognized this, yet he also understood the broader stakes. The monarchy's stability, public perception, and internal cohesion depended on Catherine's elevation. The choice was as much about the future of the institution as it was about individual personalities. The confrontation reached a critical moment when Camilla, after a measured pause, delivered an implicit ultimatum. Her words were subtle, carefully constructed, yet undeniably forceful. Advisors described the moment as a pivot point, the first indication that Camilla would not simply acquiesce. The tension was thick, and even the seasoned aides found themselves momentarily holding their breath. Every phrase, every inflection, carried significance. The stakes were not hypothetical, they were immediate and personal. Charles, aware of the implications, maintained his composure. He recognized the delicate balance required: firmness in the decision, empathy for Camilla's position, and strategic foresight to prevent escalation. He acknowledged her decades of service, her loyalty, and her role in shaping the monarchy, but he reiterated the necessity of the transfer. The conversation, while private, carried echoes of historical precedent, the quiet but decisive exercise of authority in moments of transition. Advisors observed the interaction closely. They understood that the transfer of power, though formalized on paper, was as much about human psychology as legal authority. Camilla's response would shape the palace's internal dynamics for months to come. Every gesture, every subtle inflection of tone, would be interpreted by courtiers, aides, and even the broader network of the monarchy's inner circle.